Everyone. Again, my name is Kim Tran, head of marketing here at Gimmal. I see some familiar faces and names, and welcome to our live webinar today about why data cleanup fails. I think a lot of us tend to think that technology will resolve all things. And yes, technology plays a big part of that, but there's also the reality and the trifecta of aligning people, process, and your technology solutions. And so today I am so excited to host Joe Shepley. I'm sure he is not a stranger to many of you as you see him around the industry conferences, ARMA especially. We will be at ARMA Houston in just a couple of weeks. And we are excited to share his perspectives and industry experience. I want to say I don't want to date you, Joe, so keep me honest here, but you've been in the industry as a consultant for just over 20 years to 30.
Yeah, I think I started consulting in 2008, but I was in IT before that for 8 years. And really a lot of internal consulting. When I got into consulting, it became pretty like, oh, I've been doing this. It's just no one was happy to see me because I was from IT. Whereas when you're the consultant, they tend to be happier, at least at the beginning, because they've hired you, so they're excited. So that was, but yeah, so I feel like 20 plus years.
Awesome. Well, with that said, let me please introduce you. I am just about 2 years in here at Gimmal. Gimmal is information governance simplified. And so everything from data discovery to protecting your sensitive data, we also help clients across the records management and life cycle of information management. And so with that said, I wanted to pass it over to our featured guest today, Joe Shepley, and for him to introduce himself, and we'll go over the agenda of what we'll talk about today.
Thanks, Kim. So, hey, everybody, Joe Shepley. I'm a managing director at Alvarez Marsal. It's about a 9,000 person consulting firm. Sorry, my dog is coming in and out of my room. About a 9,000 person consulting firm. It was built on, and it's very much an advisory, right? So we don't do audit, we don't do technology, we don't do legal. It's really like very traditional consulting and a lot of restructuring, a lot of corporate performance. And I sit inside of our disputes and investigations area. I run our information risk and governance practice. It's the work that I've been doing for 24 years, which is what data do we have? What are our obligations to retain it? How do we manage it properly? And these days, and the topic of our talk, how do we get rid of it when we no longer need it? It's something that is becoming much a huge regulatory focus from a lot of different regulators in the US and globally. And it's getting to the point where we can't not do it anymore. We can't just kind of, oh, well, we keep it forever, oh, well. And we'll talk about why we've been unable to do it in this webinar, and hopefully give you some really practical advice about how do you start taking those first steps to doing something about it. So,
yeah, thank you. And so like Joe mentioned, data cleanup, we all know we need to do it, kind of like, not holding on to that random pair of jeans that you've had for 20 years in your closet, but really cleaning up the data, but also knowing that at this point in time, we're creating more data and information than any point in history, and data sprawl and the data storage cost that comes with it and the risks and compliance and all of that comes with it is a business risk and really a business mandate. And so what you'll learn today, we will look at the 5 pillars of why data cleanup often fails, and we want you to engage with us. We will have Q&A, and so feel free to drop your questions in the chat and or use the Q&A function so that we actually can answer live or answer in the moment as needed. But we will also have dedicated time for live Q&A with Joe at the end of today's webinar as well. And so first we'll hit accountability. Who's responsible for what? Who do you need to get buy-in from your leadership top down, or even across the organization? And we'll talk about the buy-in and how to approach that from Joe's experience as a consultant. And then also designing an effective process. We see a lot of fear and analysis paralysis. And, one thing that we keep saying is progress, not perfection. Change is happening so quickly that starting and having something to start and mature from is so important for organizations to start building out a framework that then they can, iterate and build on. And then overcoming cultural barriers. There's a lot of change, and change is scary, change is complex. And so we can't, while we can't, we tend to put our blinders on sometimes and ignore it, but change is happening real time. So how do we position ourselves and our organizations for the best possible outcomes? And then finally, talking about different technology. You may be using a technology today that might not meet all of your needs, but also might not be able to grow or keep up with your needs in the future. And so we will then end with that. So, with that being said, let's talk about accountability, Joe. Over to
Yeah.
you.
Sure. Hey, Kim, would you go back to the last slide for a sec? Because there's something weird about that slide, right? If you ask most people to order those 5 things, you just had like note cards and you like put them in order of which ones are the most important, like that lead to failure. Tech would be like 1 or 2. And so people always ask, why is tech last? Like, because although the tech is, it's not that it's not important, it's that it's not why we fail. So that used to be why we failed. Like 10 years ago, that's why nobody was doing data cleanup, right? Because the tech couldn't scale. It was too difficult. We had to train it. Like, oh, find 400 invoices. Now it knows what an invoice is. Find 400 POs, right? Like, it's gotten to the point now where the baseline technology is so good that that's not why we're failing. These other things are the reasons why we're failing. And so it's a little bit surprising to folks that actually the technology is the easy part these days. It's getting to be able to leverage, as Kim said, to leverage the technology and get the organization to actually make a decision is the really hard part. So, okay, so next slide. So accountability. I think it's important to talk about the difference between accountability and responsibility. And I'll use an example from my kids. So if so I could have the policy in my household be that my kids are accountable and responsible for going to school. And then if they don't go to school, we'll find out who's really accountable, which is me, because they don't come and take my kids to the Department of Child Welfare Services to get in trouble. Like I get in trouble because I'm accountable, but I can't go to school. They go to school. They're responsible. This is how most corporations work, especially like financial services, insurance. A lot of bigger companies are like, oh, well, in records, like we just make the policy. We're accountable and responsible for making the policy. And then the business is accountable and responsible for compliance. And it's like, no, they're not. So what this is to say here is that there's real world accountability. And you could write all the policies you want about who's accountable at your organization and say it's the end users. One reason why cleanup fails is that the end users know that if they don't do the cleanup and there's a breach and sensitive client data goes missing, they're not getting in trouble. They don't get on a plane. They don't fly to Washington to talk to the FTC. They don't fly to Sacramento to talk to the California AG. They don't have to get in a cab and go downtown Manhattan to the circuit court or whatever and talk to New York DFS. They don't. That's the general counsel. That's your CISO. So, and what this is all to say is that you need to figure out who's the person who gets on the plane at your organization. And at most organizations, in one of those people that's going to be in the plane is your general counsel. She's ultimately the highest ranking person who is responsible for risk. And so and these days privacy is rolling up to legal. Even for something like New York DFS, which is a cyber law, there's an attestation by your CISO that you're compliant and it requires data deletion. And ultimately your general counsel is going to be involved in that attestation because it's a wildly legal document that's public. So once you know who's really accountable, that person has to take the accountability, right? They have to, that senior leader has to own the outcome of data cleanup. They're not going to do it, right? They don't go to school, right? The kids are going to go to school. And so the responsibility for execution, and that's what we'll talk about in a second, there's a range of different folks who are responsible for execution. And if you let them know that you're not accountable for this at all, I am, and I'm general counsel, so you know what, do it. Because
Yeah.
I'm the one who's going to get in trouble. And these days, regulators are even calling out executives by name in the
Yeah.
findings. It's like, woo, it's getting hot in here, man. Like you mentioned my name. It's like we're non-compliant. We don't like that, right? And the
Yeah.
board members don't like to be called out. That nobody wants that kind of personal and professional spotlight. So letting them know that, no, of course I'm accountable. I'm general counsel. Like I'm going to go to Washington. I'm going to have to talk to the regulators. I talk to opposing counsel. Sure. Got it. But you're responsible. Because I'm accountable, I'm going to make damn well sure that you do it.
Yeah.
But if
Yeah.
they're not, if they haven't taken on the accountability and they've devolved it incorrectly to the end users, it doesn't get done because they don't know they're supposed to be making folks do it because they're like, well, I'm not accountable, but they are. Anyway, that's
Yeah.
that's once you get that aligned, without that, everything that I'm talking about is just, you might as well chuck it. Don't even bother.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
not going to work.
Yeah. That's really important too, because I think, I'm hearing what you're saying, and I think the delineation between accountability and responsibility is so key because, and sometimes there may be some overlap, but really, I think the important thing that I'm taking away from you right now is shared accountability and responsibility. And really making sure that everybody top down across, zigzag, whatever, knows the shared risk together and it's not just on one person.
That's right.
I feel like there's a lot of, there tends to be sometimes like playing the blame game and organizations. And I think having that trust in each other and shared risk and shared trust, shared accountability, all of that is so important. Could you walk me through kind of one, two, three, four, from your perspective, how do people, what are the challenges that people have in getting their senior leadership to be accountable, maybe, or vice versa?
Yeah. So, I mean, so like the basic, I mean, what this is meant to show is, so senior leadership says, look, we are accountable. And two, that's different than responsibility. Here's who's responsible. And we're going to support, encourage, carrot, stick, usually both, to get that to happen. And then what happens when it doesn't happen? Like,
Mm.
because a lot of times one of the things that's difficult about accountability is that the business goes, well, that's my data. Well, it actually isn't your data. So that's the enterprise's data. And once it's past our legal obligation to retain it, it's the value is going like this and the risk is going like this. And the implications of that are that I'm general counsel. I'm going to have to go explain to the FTC why we're not following our own policies. And like they're going to accuse us of deceptive trade practices, for example.
Mhm.
So getting that clear, it's sort of like, as an employee, we know that our email is not kind of private when we're at work, right? We understand that that's the company's data, even if it's a personal email. It's a similar kind of thing. And then finally, how are we going to monitor to make sure it's happening? And some of that gets into like when we talk about building a process, right? Some of that gets into when we talk about buy-in, because that's once we've got the accountable person, let's call it general counsel, and she's taken accountability and says, got it, this is my butt in the sling if this doesn't happen, now what? And then that's the next step, right? So now we can take the next step and figure out how we're going to get all the responsible people bought in so
Mhm.
that her accountability has some teeth to it, right? She can feel
Yeah.
good about having that accountability because she knows that we've got buy-in from the people who can actually do it to protect her and
Yeah.
and allow her to live up to her accountability.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think this is a good segue into the next slide about,
Absolutely. So I love this diagram. I love EDRN at A&M. We're actually on the we help out with it and all this kind of stuff in at previous firms. But I like to tease them because the original version of the there's an electronic discovery reference model. It had 9 boxes, and one box said information governance, and then the rest was like e-discovery. And I was like, really, one box? I wish it was one box, but they fixed it. So they made it a little bit more complicated. And I love this because if you were looking down at a table, these would be all the table cards of who needs to be sitting at the table, literally.
Mm.
And so I also love the fact that privacy and security got split out. It used to be together, and that shows you how much those two fields have evolved in the last 10 years. Privacy and security used to kind of be the same thing, and they're for
Yep.
sure not at all
Yep.
anymore. But what's great about this is you've got to have all these people at the table in order to make decisions about information governance and particularly about cleaning up your data. Cleaning up your data is not, we'll talk about what the process looks like. It's actually super duper straightforward. It's pretty laughably straightforward, the steps you have to take, but the decisions that have to get made as you're going through those steps cannot be made by any single one of these people. Although ultimately, if general counsel has taken accountability for data cleanup, she's going to listen to IT security, the business says, oh, we could mine this data and get all sorts of value. So cyber goes, oh gosh, but our risk surface is so big, and privacy goes, no way. California's going to crush us, and legal goes, well, all right. And they listen to all of it. And at the end of the day, general counsel gets to decide because, again, if she truly is accountable, she's taking that accountability. She has to get on the plane. So yeah, she gets to decide. And maybe some cases we'll end up keeping that claims data longer than the law would allow because we think there's going to be value. Sometimes we won't, but it's not enough to just have these people sitting around the table. And I think this is sometimes we've got buy-in without accountability. And I think we've all been in these meetings where we have all these people. We're an information governance steering committee, but no one's
Yep.
accountable. We've made the business accountable for cleanup. And so it's a completely ineffectual team because we could do anything we want, but since we don't have the real world accountability hasn't been accepted, we say, well, how's end users? They never do it. And then they were yelling at the business. Why don't you people clean up this data? They're like, because I don't get in trouble for not cleaning up the data and I don't want
Yeah.
to. And so they have no way to affect change if we don't have the right accountability. But if you have the right accountability, now this is the team that's going to begin to flesh out the responsibility for information governance and in particular data cleanup and start executing it, right?
Yeah.
That's why it's so important.
Yeah. Aside from the general counsel and just listening to you share, we had our Gimmal physical user group fairly recently, maybe as of last year, and we were talking about disposition. And so I wanted to call that out because it's highlighted in red here. And for, for a customer, the soundbite was, I wish there was a button, like a little button I could just press, delete on. But I also want to have permission that if I hit that button, I will not be in trouble to
That's
delete
right.
something. And so there's
It's
a
really
lot of
important.
fear, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of almost like hesitancy with that. And so I think there's also buy-in, but also maybe permission to
Yeah.
hit the delete button.
And you've anticipated when we get to the process slide. The
Mhm.
process is what lets you have the confidence because we'll get to it, but no one should have to think, right? It's almost like the checklist manifesto. Like I
Yep.
literally just have to do the 4 steps and then the next person does their 4 steps. And if we do that, we all feel really comfortable but we'll get to that. But all right. So great, Joe. We need buy-in. Well, how do we do it? Right. Okay. So one, there's personal impact. Every single one of these roles has goals that this is what they get fired for not doing. All right. So maybe they don't get on the plane the way general counsel does, but like in risk, in legal, in the business, in IT, they have targets, they have metrics, they have things that they're supposed to accomplish. So how does data governance, how does information governance support those? Okay. So they need to understand that. So that cyber goes, of course, I'm going to get involved. Smaller risk surface, breaches are less expensive, breaches are less damaging. I'm not spending time restoring picnic notices during a ransomware attack. Like, yeah, I want to get rid of 40% of my shared drives. That'd be amazing. So like everyone in privacy, same thing. I don't want to be caught flat-footed when California asks me a question about retention. I want to be able to come back to them and show them how, for example, my retention schedule is tied to sensitive data categories. So I can tell them how long my longest obligation and shortest obligation for like biometric data is and what laws and what records. Like, I love that. So there's wins for everybody. So what's that? And that personalized impact is their operational goals, right? And then what's the incentive for being engaged? Now, it's yes, success in their own the work that they do every day. But I think one of the most important ways to incentivize engagement is to succeed. Nobody wants to be on a sinking ship. And that's why they don't want to be involved because we've tried this before and it failed. And like everybody who was involved, and it's like, oh yeah, Joe, yeah, he was involved in that project. Nothing happened. And no one wants to be part of an unsuccessful, highly visible project. It's like the worst of two. If nobody knew about it, that'd be fine. But this effort is going to be one of the most visible things. It's most companies I talk to in the Fortune 1000, it's a top 3 board priority is getting rid of data that we don't have an obligation to retain. So it's highly visible, highly risky. And so if we can be successful and build the program in such a way that we get little wins all the time to show that we're being successful, that
Yep.
really people feel good about being part of that because they're part of a successful team. There is a shared vision, and we'll talk about how, right? The part of bringing all these folks together is we want that diversity of opinion, right? We want cyber has a different way of seeing the world than IT, than legal, than records. That's great. Like we want that. But we can't stay in that position of just like diversity where we don't agree. We have to have a shared vision that's informed by all those diverse perspectives of what information governance is going to do at the organization. And for the purposes of this webinar, and for most organizations I've been working with in the last 6 years, they're not trying to do like knowledge management or get value out of information or any of that. They're freaking out that they want to get rid of the data they don't need because they're
Yeah.
one breach away from like disaster. So the shared vision is around what's the most effective, efficient, defensible away to clean up 25 years of sensitive data that
Yep.
is like just waiting to sink the company, right? And then
Yeah.
communicate and educate, right? So change management, trumpeting. Well, first of all, you're going to touch a lot of people in the organization with this initiative. But educating people why we're doing this, right? We're not taking away email, right? We're not doing this just to like delete stuff that you need. Most people probably have no idea across the organization of the risks that we face as an organization for keeping data that might be of value and probably isn't, right? So that's critical. And now, so you've got accountability, and you have all the people who are going to be the doers or have the teams that are doers are now bought in, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so important that you address the psychological, behind the scenes of this, because people are comfortable with status quo. A lot of folks are comfortable with the status quo. A lot of folks, like you said, like nothing happened when we held on to data that we didn't need, or records we didn't need, or information we didn't need until the data breach happened.
right,
And data breaches is a matter of when now and not if. And so
that's right.
people really need to be prepared. And so there's that psychological aspect of it that I love that you're talking about, because it is real. It's part of change and saying no to the status quo moving forward.
It's a lot of
Um,
Dr. Phil, I'll be honest with you. It's a lot of it's a lot of emotional handholding.
it
But
really
that's
is.
why the process is so important, right? Because so you get the general counsel, she takes accountability. We get the 8 or 10 folks on the information governance steering committee who are all leaders, right? Very successful people. Um, what we want to do is design a process so that when we're actually dispositioning data, we're actually evaluating data sets to see if we should delete them. And when the answer is yes, and then we go to delete them, we don't want anyone to be thinking, right? So I had worked with a guy who used to work at a guy named Matt McClellan, who's one of my favorite people. I've known him forever. He said it can't be a before coffee and an after coffee decision. So like if I would make that decision differently, right? That can't be part of the process. So the process has to be unambiguous. And so the goal is to do all of the thinking during design time. So that information governance steering committee, right, with all the perspectives we need, we deputize people. If those people are at too high a level, we deputize people, and we come up with, and here's the process, right? What's the data? What's our legal obligation to retain it? Is it past its legal obligation? I'm sorry, this sounds so silly, but it really is this straightforward. If it is past, do we have any other uh, active or reasonably anticipated preservation obligation like a legal hold? If no, we delete. What you'll notice isn't in that is asking permission. You don't check with anybody. So the goal of this process is that when it's past its retention period and there's no preservation obligation, it gets deleted. There's no step for like, and then go to the business data owner and check with them. Like that, that is probably one of the biggest reasons why data cleanup fails is building in a check at the end to ask if it's okay. And the way I say it is, look, at A&M, if I don't have a receipt, I don't get an expense reimbursed. I have to have a receipt. $1, it doesn't matter, right? If I don't turn in a receipt for like a $300 dinner, right, with a client, and I don't give any receipt, they don't say, hey, Joe, would it be okay if we didn't pay you for that expense because you don't have a receipt? They just don't pay it because that's the policy. You just follow it, right? And that's where we have to get to with data cleanup. So that process I just described, there is no step for checking with the end user who is the data owner at all. Because the data owner, they own the data when we have a legal right to have the data. But if it's past its retention, it's pretty much illegal for us to have the data. And we have
Yep.
policies that say we don't. So there shouldn't be a step for asking. So the goal is at design time. And then when you think about those steps, what is the data? Well, gosh, IT, RIM, right? Privacy. Those folks are really the business, really, they're like gonna kind of know what the data is, where it is, right? 2, what's our legal obligation to retain it? RIM, privacy, legal, right? The business gets to weigh in a little bit like, oh man, like I know it says 1 year, but because of the way that we do HR and hiring, we often want to go back to candidates. Can we keep it 3 years? And then who gets to decide? General counsel. She's accountable. She'll say, that's reasonable. Let's note it. So that if a regulator asks, we can say, we know that the law is 1 year, but for operational reasons, we're keeping it for 3 years. And that's going to be totally, that's like totally cool. But
Yeah.
is it past its retention, right? So that's your RIM folks. That's right. And then is it subject to a preservation obligation? Probably the hardest step. And when we talk about culture later, the culture of the organization, legal's very hard. They're coming from a place where legal holds, you almost don't need to do them because we're not deleting anything, right? Like managing a 1,400, 1,500 legal matter, legal hold portfolio when you don't delete data is really easy. And the answer is we don't delete anything. But if we're going to have a systematic process to, on a regular basis, delete all data past our legal obligation to retain it, the way they're doing legal holds, I guarantee you, everybody on this call, if you're not doing data cleanup, and by the way, none of you are for the most part, the way you're doing legal holds, your organization will not work when you are doing data cleanup because they've never contemplated that somehow data would just be regularly disposed of. It never did. So this is that's a really, really hard step. And then the delete step is mostly IT. There's a lot of technical complexity. A share drive, not so bad. You just hit delete. Structured database systems, DB2, homegrown mainframes, third-party systems like a Workday or an SAP sometimes aren't even amenable to deletion of certain pieces of data. So like each step has its challenges, and the goal is to get the right people from that Trivial Pursuit piece to be in the upfront design of it so we don't have exceptions and we don't need thinking later. All the thinking's done when we build it. And so now we've got clear guidelines. Decisions can be automated, not in the sense that the robot does it, but it's more automatic. All I have to do is answer a series of yes, no, if then questions and I get a result. And it's
Mhm.
if you ask Kim and you ask me and she had coffee and I didn't, or I do it after, like the answer is the same. Because what regulators in courts and opposing counsel, adversarial third parties love ambiguity. They love individual judgment, right? Because that's terrible because they can rip holes in that. But when it's like, no, we literally go down these checklists and
Yeah.
that's how we get to the same answer. It's perfect, right? And so you've involved the stakeholders because all those folks sitting around the table who are either the responsible folks or they are on the teams that are responsible. We've gone through the thinking at design time. We've hit all the snags, and then there will be exceptions. Business changes, regulation changes. We don't even call it an exception. It's like it goes back and it becomes part of the process so that it's another branch. There shouldn't
Yep.
really be any exceptions. It's straightforward, right? Anyway,
Yeah.
and this
No,
gives you the confidence because I'm just doing my 4 steps and I know that's clear and I just have to answer these if then questions and I get a yes or a no. Delete, don't delete. And I don't have to then go to users and oh God, is this the right? Nobody thinks there's no and I've heard people say don't say no thinking. There's no judgment at runtime. You're
yeah.
thinking because you're answering the questions, but you don't have to decide, you don't have to make any kind of a judgment-based decision that relies on your expertise. It's literally a checklist is what you get to. That's how I've done it with clients, and it's incredibly effective. And the first couple of times they're like, oh, we'll check. We want to see, let's see what's getting deleted. And it becomes so boring and mind-numbing. This becomes routine. And so it becomes kind of like dial tone, like, well, yeah, it just happens. It's like your team's chats going away after 30 days. No one cares
Yeah.
anymore. Right? Who
Yeah.
knows?
Yeah. No, it's definitely, again, I think there's that tendency to hold on just in case, just in case. So
Yeah.
I love that. And I also love that, the reminder of measure twice or three times or even four times and cut once.
Once.
Cut once. And then having that feedback loop, to the point of progress, not perfection. Things are constantly going to be changing. People leave the organization. People come back, boomerang back. And so I love that this is laid out, and I'm just really excited because you come from a consulting background. And yes, in theory, all of these frameworks should work. And then you add people, you add processes, you add the psychology behind it, and it gets complex. So I love that you're sharing all of this. We did have a question that I think would be relevant to answer now
Yeah.
rather than at the end, especially because you mentioned, general counsel being the accountable executive. You talk about legal buy-in, but do you feel like without legal buy-in, do you feel the process has little chance of success? Yes
Yep.
or no? And maybe who else should be on board?
Yeah, it's very little chance of success without legal. That's the only lever you can throw, right? Like, let's see. In the last 6 years, I've only had one client where we could prove savings from deleting data.
Mm.
The entire reason why you're doing this is a compliance reason. And if legal's not bought in, it's like, what, how, they're right, because they are the ones, generally them and the CISO, right, are the ones who are real world accountable for most of this stuff. So if they don't see the value in it, if they're not bought in, your step one is get them bought. So like I would ask, why aren't they bought in? Do they not understand that they're the ones who are going to be filleted for this when it happens? Do they not understand that they have to answer to California, to Colorado, to Bavaria, to the FTC, to the Department of Insurance, whoever, HIPAA or Office of Civil Rights? Do they not know that? So the only way that maybe this would work is if you're a large enough organization and you have a chief compliance officer.
Mm.
That person sometimes, if you're big enough to have that function, um, depending upon what what compliance they're responsible for. So like at a large healthcare organization, often the chief compliance officer is responsible for HIPAA compliance. So then that's the person. But if you don't have it, so if at your organization legal would be the person that should be accountable and they're not bought in, you won't succeed.
Mm.
I would be really, really shocked because they're the hammer. Like that's the person who should care. If they don't care, none of those people around that table are going to care because they see that legal doesn't care. So they don't care. My lawyer
That's
said it's
really,
not a big problem. So I'm not going to do it.
I started off my career working with lawyers, and so for
My
me it's
condolences. Just kidding.
well, that's also why I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah.
But we're on record, so I will keep it diplomatic. No, I'm just
Yeah.
kidding. Okay.
You can.
So
I think you're always safe to throw lawyers under the bus. They're sort of a generally reviled sort of category of professionals. Although they're wonderful people, but I think the larger public thinks of them as being terrible. They're actually really
yeah.
wonderful. And honestly, we can't do our jobs without them. So like, I'll just say like, in my career as a consultant, and I think it's important. If you're hiring professional services folks to help you do this kind of thing, you've got to have outside counsel. Like I can't answer legal questions, but the questions that were like when we designed that process, it has legal implications because it's
Yep.
progress, not perfection. And laws
Yep.
are vague. California doesn't tell you exactly what to do. You got to interpret it. And so, like, when we decide that, okay, from an operational perspective, it'd be awesome if date created started the clock on retention for anything that said active, right?
Yeah.
And so we'll say active plus 3 years is date created plus 3 years, or date last modified plus 3 years. And I'll say, great, that would take out 40% of the share drive. Don't look like that has legal someone's going to have to go to court on that, right? Someone's going to have to meet and confer for e-discovery. Somebody's going to have understood what is kind of like the legal ramifications of that operational decision. And for me, if we don't have outside counsel, it's very, very difficult and I would say we didn't say it here, but another success factor, if you don't have outside counsel that knows what they're doing in information governance and in data cleanup kind of stuff, it's going to be very hard to do this because your internal legal team doesn't have enough experience. They work at one firm, but you go get a AM Law 30 or AM Law 50 firm that does this stuff all the time, and the partner's really good and the associates are really good. They've done it 20 times, 30 times. They know what other people are doing. They can assure you that the decision put you in the middle of the pack. You're not cutting edge and you're not lagging because that's what you want. You want to be right status quo. You want to be like everybody else in terms of your risk, right? How you're looking at this risk. And it's very hard to do without outside counsel. So anyway, culture, every single one of those slices has a different culture. We're teasing lawyers, right? Lawyers, HR, records managers, like I'm wearing the like library sweater, right? Like privacy, cyber, right? It's like a guild. It's like a union, and so
Yeah.
they share certain kind of cultural things. They look at the world a certain way, right? The business doesn't always have a risk lens. Legal always has a risk lens, right? That's different than cyber risk, and like so understanding those cultural differences because of their functional area, just as a profession, and why they might resist. And then I think then you have the individual who happens to be the general counsel or happens to be the CISO or happens to be the records manager. And what about them as an individual might be leading to resistance, right? Then we've absolutely got to be conducting outreach. People have to, especially if it's been tried before and it's failed. It's like, oh, this is that email management project. We try to take away our email. This is like they tried to give us Box or something, or we tried to get SharePoint in, and we all have stories of like they tried to do it and it failed. And
Yep.
now it's like this is going to be just like that. It's going to fail again. So the educational outreach is this isn't that again. And here's why we're really doing it, right? In the past, we probably weren't doing it for the reasons we're doing it now. And so the reasons we're doing it now should be important to all of us. And so there's ways that you can really educate people that this is going to be different than last time, right?
Yeah.
Um, and promoting data hygiene, again, it's not because it's because it's good to do. It's because we're personally and as an organization under threat if we don't do it. And you
Yeah.
can even, depending upon the culture of your organization, it's really a national security problem, right? Because nation state actors are getting data out of our systems that we don't need, where it's past its legal obligation. It's incredibly important to them. They intersect it with all sorts of other data they get, and it's incredibly damaging sort of database of information on US citizens. So you can also play the national security card that like it's not just about the customers that buy the cell phone case that we manufacture, right? This is like there's a patriotic sort of duty to not be, because other places like China and North Korea, right? They view this data as being of national security interest. It's infrastructure that's
Mm.
critical, and that's why they have privacy laws, not necessarily because they care about their citizens' privacy. It's because it's a national security concern. Okay, so then reward and recognize. And this is so dependent on the culture of your organization. Some places, like it's hokey to give out awards for this and that. Other places, they love it. You know your organization. You know what's the appropriate non-corny way, like compelling way that you can reward and recognize folks. And then you lead by example. So again, people would raise their hands. It's like I see this so much. Oh yeah, but email goes away after 6 months. But in legal, we're going to keep it longer, and we let the execs have it longer. Like first of all, hey dummy, that's the riskiest stuff. Those are the people who should absolutely not have any emails. Like we don't. Who cares about my email? Like, but I don't want like the president of the company, her email. We need to delete that like the day, one day. Like so. Anyway, but when people see that, they're like, oh, I get it. Yeah. So of course legal gets to keep their stuff forever, right? So again, we want it to be that steering committee of the table, general counsel, by being the exemplars of it, that lets everybody know that like this isn't just a thing they're foisting on us, and they get a pass, right? You
Yep.
can't have it. So
Awesome. Yeah, I think, culture is a huge deal, and especially for folks who may be in, very I want to say like legacy cultures,
yeah,
older organizations, change is hard and there's a lot of resistance. And so I love the educational outreach that you touched on, because I hear a lot of like, oh, we tried that before, it didn't work.
yep,
Okay, but what exactly didn't work?
right,
And once you start digging deeper, people are like, oh, well, we don't know exactly why, but we just know it didn't work, like the outcome. And
yeah,
it's almost like, okay, well, let's reframe the game. Let's reverse engineer, let's dissect this as scientific experiments almost. And sometimes, I'm thinking about Einstein here. Sometimes it's just a little tweak that you need to do to become successful, whether it's getting a different person on board than the last time around, or, maybe just tweaking the timing or tweaking the approach or framework or whatever it is. And so I really encourage folks that, if it did not work before, figure out what exactly did not work
yeah,
and how you want to approach that and get ahead of that, and your plan to overcome that to begin with. And I'm sure you run into this a lot, Joe.
all the
Um,
time.
yeah. Okay, I see some Q&A come in here. And so let me see. Speaking of general counsel again, do you believe general counsel in most companies understand the risk of not performing rot remediation?
I would say that if you'd asked me this question 10 years ago, I'd say that it was probably 75% where a keep everything forever is less risky, and 25% were like the second we're not legally obligated to have it, I want it gone. It's probably the other way now. It's 75-25. I think I think the vast majority of general counsel that I bump into or corporate legal, they understand that they should be getting rid of data. And they're well aware that they're obligating themselves under California. They're obligating themselves under New York DFS if they're subject to it. They're obligated under HIPAA. They're obligated under a range of global laws, and so they know. They also know that their e-discovery costs are out of control. and that if they had less data, that the vast majority of that data is not even relevant, really. And yet they pay law firms a lot of money and service providers like A&M a lot of money to host and go through and technology and search through it, and it's not really relevant. So I think they get it. I think the hard thing is they don't know how they're going to tackle the e-discovery legal hold problem, that fourth step, because they're looking at their hold portfolio and they're going, man, if you brought me a data set and asked me whether it was on one of these 1,400 holds, I don't really know how I would do that. And so they get nervous, right? And so that's probably the biggest legal hurdle, is working and holding their hand and bringing outside counsel in to help them change their culture and approach to legal holds. And lawyers hate process. We literally build a process for evaluating whether something's on hold. Because their process is, oh, I take my senior litigator and she spends 4 days thinking about it. Like that, no. Like I want, so like we literally will do like basic process mapping. Like, okay, so I'm going to sit with her and I'm going to ask her what she's thinking, and we're going to turn it into a checklist. And I would bet you $1 that at every single one of your firms, if we did that, we could get 80% of your holds to a checklist, yes or no. And then the 20% that aren't, weird DOJ or like class action lawsuits or like asbestos or like whatever, right? Is not an exception. It's just path B. And there's ways around it. But that's probably the hardest thing these days is general counsels, like 75% of them know they got to do it. It's, oh, but it makes my head hurt when I start to think about like our legal holds. So that's part of my job psychologically, is to make her feel comfortable with that change. And outside counsel helps me because they say, no, 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 no. All your peers are going this way. You can get rid of those tapes without mounting them. Like you can use this kind of big bucket approach to your legal holds. It's okay. You can
Yeah.
rescope them. It's fine. But I can't tell them that. They're never, like, I'm not a lawyer. So outside counsel plus my coaching, psychological coaching skills and support, that's what is needed for general counsels these days, so that they can live up to the vision they have of, I know I need to do it. Let's don't.
Yeah.
It makes my head hurt, right? They don't know. They can't even start to think about it.
I love that. Well, I also love all the questions coming in. And so we may just do Q&A live in the moment.
Yeah,
But we're also coming at the last pillar of today's agenda around
yeah.
technology, last but never least.
Never least, especially when you're being hosted by a technology company. No, so I think, I was debating what slide to show. I think the most important thing, and this is like any technology, like, and Kim, you know this because you've been in software for a long time. People buy software without knowing what they really want to do with it. Like, oh, I'm supposed to have that. Like, okay. Like people come to me all the time because there's this category, governance, risk, and compliance software. It's kind of like does everything, right? And people are like, I need GRC software. I'm like, why? They're like, well, to do GRC, but no, but like literally, do you want to like a policy repository? Do you want to like, are you doing third-party risk? Like, so I think the most important thing is, so what fits our people and our data cleanup needs? And so the question is, so one, data cleanup is your use case. So that's great. But then you need to think about like, is it structured data? Is it unstructured data? Am I doing like, do I want to do really, is it go forward? Or am I just cleaning up legacy stuff? My 100 petabytes of legacy data. Is it primarily for privacy, the cleanup, or is it for cyber? Or is it just general kind of high, like records management, like kind of all kind of records? Because if it's privacy data, it's generally going to be structured database systems, and it's a very different kind of task than like, I just want to get rid of rot on share drives, right? Or I want to manage email better. So and by the way, folks like Gimmal love this because they get people coming to them all the time who don't know what they really want or need to do. And it's really painful in the sales process to know whether we're even the right, because you may find this shocking. Software companies don't want to sell software to people who don't need it. Like those companies aren't in business for very long. So they want to know what you're trying to do. They want to make sure you understand what they do. And if and only if it's a fit, do they then want to talk about how can we sell you what you need? It's actually horrible for software companies. They could, next time you see Kim at a conference, buy her a glass of rosé and ask her, tell me about the times when you sold stuff to clients and they didn't know what they wanted and you didn't really know it, right? We misunderstood. It's more trouble than it's worth for software companies. So be a good buyer and an educated buyer. What are we trying to do? Right? Because then you'll know like, oh, well, I don't have any cyber needs. So why would I get a data cleanup software that comes out of the cyber world and does all this user behavioral analytics? Or no, actually, my CISO is going to be the buyer. So like, wow, software that has that might be more valuable than something that comes out of e-discovery land, right? So like knowing what you're trying to do and then really being collaborative with your software partners. Don't just have them do a demo and send you a sheet and decide whether to buy it. Like work with them, have multiple meetings to talk about what your needs are. And if they're good, they will help you clarify your thinking about what you need. Don't be afraid of interacting with them, right?
Yeah.
And that process of collaboration with them will help you figure out what you're trying to do with tech and whether they're the right solution. And if they are the right solution, you just learn so much about what it's going to be like to be their partner throughout that process that it's not a blind date. It becomes friends introduce us, right? It's more,
Yep.
it's a more of a collaborative, not just a vendor transactional relationship, which doesn't work, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, again, like there's so much change happening. We can't possibly, as humans, learn every single thing. And so leveraging your peers, leveraging, case studies, use cases from other peers, like you mentioned the general counsel, outside counsel, having that lens of what are other people doing so that we
yeah,
can leverage lessons learned, not just this blanket statement, oh, it didn't work. Okay, but we have to make it
right.
work. We have
Yeah,
to make it work. So let's figure it out. What are other people doing? I mean, we see this among our user groups a lot, and we see, I've seen some faces and names that I recognize and have met in person. And for me, it's always great to hear, whether it's on a virtual user group or in person to see what has succeeded. And a lot of times it's this through this information sharing. Um, I'm also a technology buyer for marketing needs, and tech
yeah,
regret is a thing. There's a lot of emotional investment when you purchase a technology because, and I love that you started off with accountability and buy-in and all of that, because ultimately you're not just buying a technology for data cleanup, you're really buying a technology for the entire organization and protecting the entire organization from
mhm.
corporate reputational risk, very real business risks. I know that for data breaches, I saw a report somewhere recently that said, oh, well, we have cyber insurance, so, settlements, right? But
Not going to cover anything, dude. I
a
hate to,
lot
I
of
hate to
us,
break it to you.
yeah, great idea. Do you have $1 million hanging out every month?
Yeah.
I'd rather pay, $100,000 for the right technology, the right uses versus, this unsustainable settlement that we keep hearing about in the news. But speaking of litigation,
Yeah,
Tracy had a comment, and I don't know if you have any follow-up thoughts here,
I
but
do.
she says, I see more legal departments consider litigation as a regular cost of doing business. There's little concern for retention compliance. It makes it challenging for RIM folks.
Yeah.
Um, any thoughts or,
Yeah.
shared experience around that?
So Tracy, I love that. And in fact, on the EDRM circle, legal could be split into a couple of slices. And they have different added because like, and these days, privacy often is reporting into general counsel, and then you've got litigation reporting into general counsel. And you put your finger on a really great point. The litigators are not going to be your primary driver inside of legal. They don't have any real motivation to help with data cleanup. They get rewarded on winning cases. Like that's what they get. So data cleanup, and I know we thought like there's no real way to tie data cleanup to direct either winning a case, getting them to settle, or having it be less expensive. That's a really difficult business case, right? They have to either get it and go like, yeah, if you could do this without messing with me, perfect, love it. But like, they're not going to be the champion. It's general counsel insofar as she owns other legal kind of risk, not just litigation, and it's primarily privacy because basically, and it basically boils down, if you're subject to California, it boils down to you have to put on your website for every kind of sensitive personal information how long you retain it, and you're representing you dispose of it afterwards. And you're allowed to say, if you can't give a one time period, you could say something like, we keep it as long as we're legally obligated, and then we delete it. The problem is that if you said that now, you're lying because you don't do that. Like No, like nobody on this call would feel comfortable showing California their data retention and disposition procedures. It's because they don't exist, because you're keeping everything forever and you have a policy that says you don't. But you can't say we keep it forever because California say you can't keep it forever. So we're in a rock and a hard place. And that's why there's all this fear and consternation, because general counsel knows we're one enforcement action by California away from having lied on our website or been vague, and they're going to find out we don't delete anything. It's going to be horrible. So you're right. Don't go to litigation. Go to the folks in legal, or if it's not legal, it's maybe your chief compliance officer who own privacy risk, because they're the ones who they don't sleep at night because of this problem at all. And if you're a financial services, insurance, banking, and you do work in New York, go to your CISO. They're attesting right now. By April 15th, they have to put a letter that says that they're compliant and it's public. So I can go search and see who said that they're doing it. And it's part 500.13. You have to get rid of non-public information when you no longer have a legal obligation. So if your CISO's attesting, and by the way, you're not doing that. And the reason why they're attesting, and again, to tie it back to litigation, right? Litigation has no skin in the game. They have skin in the game if the lawsuit doesn't go well. CISO has skin in the game. GC has skin in the game if they own privacy, because they are the ones who get on the plane. Your CISO is attesting right now on the strength of a records management policy and a retention schedule that you follow it, because they have so much other stuff to do for New York DFS attestation. When you educate them that we're actually not following that policy, and y'all just attested to a New York financial regulator publicly that we're following that policy, that's how change starts to happen. So I love that comment, because I should be more precise. Don't go to litigation, go to legal and the folks who look after privacy risk. Got it.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, Tracy just mentioned, thank you so much for your thoughts. Excellent food for thought. Thank you, Tracy, for asking questions and being engaged. I want to be mindful of time. And so Joanne had one last
Yeah.
question. I love that people are just, in the moment asking you. So thank you for answering.
Stump the chump, right? That's like,
Yeah.
it's like I'm cooking.
Yeah. So Joanne asked, is it possible to apply the same logic for file evaluation when you have hybrid paper records along with your digital records collection? So some historic legacy paper records do not have associated metadata.
Yeah,
Um,
it's similar. Like at the top level, it's the same process. And then the question is, when does it start to branch for different things? And so it's going to depend a little bit. Paper without, like, boxes that aren't labeled or are labeled improperly, there's an analog in, that's a weird way to say it. There's an analog in the digital world, which is you have data that has poor metadata. You have, like, I'll just throw IBM under the bus for a hot second, but any of the ECM vendors, IBM, OpenText, Documentum, right? You have these old installs that they had in the early 2000s, and then they keep migrating the data in, and there's just like reports with like a 40-digit number title. There's no metadata. Like, that's a similar thing. You got to figure out what to do. And
yeah,
so I can say that if you've got a vendor for box storage, that's one of the bigger ones, right? You've got Iron Mountain, you've got Access, there's a bunch of them. I'm not as familiar with all of them anymore. Just about all of them have services to help you with this. So, like, the
yep,
last thing you would want to do is come to a consultant, like a consulting firm, to ask them to do that for you, unless that's all they do. It's highly specialized. You got to go all over the world. But your best option is to have if you've got a bigger service, not just like a mom and pop garage outside of Austin somewhere, right? Like a real company that you do business with. Almost all of them have services. And there are people who, like, if you think I'm a geek, they geek out on, like, paper records management, and that's all they do. And they will
yeah,
crush it for you. And it's way cost effective. And so if you've got a paper box problem like this, yes, this information governance team builds the process. But when you get down to the, like, click here, click there steps of paper, leverage those kind of partners, right? Because that's all they live boxes day in and day out. And the complexities of box destruction is like, so
yeah,
yeah, that's just like you want outside counsel. When you get down to your boxes, unless you don't have like 40 boxes or something, but if you're like a Fortune 1000 company, you have like tens of thousands of boxes, just go to your provider, and you'll be glad that you did.
yeah, yeah. And especially within certain industries like life sciences, we just hosted a webinar on life sciences and pharma clients lots of physical records, lots of documentation.
Unbelievable.
And so, other than general counsel and legal, I would imagine IT and all these storage costs as well. Like even for my personal phone, I love saving hundreds of pictures of my kid doing whatever she's doing. Do I really need them? No,
Yeah.
but do I want to delete them? Also no. So so
And the reason
yeah,
why you got to work with that outside vendor is because, right, they're not dumb. If a box costs 10 cents a month, $1 a month, it costs 18 to $36 to destroy it all in. So you can't get a 1 year return. It's like those monthly storage places. You never actually get your stuff out of the storage locker. The business model is set up to disincent you. The switching costs is there's a lot of friction to delete boxes, which is why you have to partner with them because you got to use your leverage as a customer to say
yep,
like, dude, I'm not having an 18-month payback. Like we need to get it down to a year. And they often they're willing to work with you, but you can't just like ask them to delete 20,000 boxes. Like it'll be so expensive. You got to work with them. And
yeah,
then you can kind of set up a good, again, like with software, a good partnership with them. They're not just the people who you pay to keep your boxes and you're angry at them because it's so expensive. You're a partner to achieve business goals around de-risking your paper. And you'll be surprised. They're wonderful to work with. And they have lots of great ideas about
yeah.
how you can lower your costs while still destroying boxes without getting caught in that 18 to 36-month payback period, which like nobody's going to sign off on that, right? Anyway.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll take one more question here so that we can move on. But Natalia mentioned, and only because we're still talking about storage and all of that. Natalia, thank you for your question. Storage
Yeah.
vendors normally do just box management. They don't know our content. How do we leverage their help? I think this goes back to your point, Joe, where you need to know exactly what you want out of your
Yep.
technology or partners. Because we do have technology solutions out there, including our own, that tracks content of boxes and all of that. And so I don't know, but no one wants to hear from me. Everybody wants to
Yeah.
hear from you,
Well,
Joe.
so it depends. So the bigger folks like Iron Mountain, they have people who are subject matter experts, and they're often in country. So like basic like the stuff everybody invoices and all that stuff, that's super easy. Then if you get into like energy, pharma, right, where it's like what kind of GXP document is this? Is this a research and development? Is this regulatory affairs, right? So it's going to depend on the vendor and then the country whether they have those resources. But in general, they collaborate with you to take their standard offering and how they would do this, which is sampling. They look at it. The box says invoices 2005. They open it up. There's contracts from 1998. Uh-oh, not very accurate. And they sample. And then they'll be like, well, actually, we hit, about 80% of these boxes are labeled. If it's labeled, it's right. And then they're like, cool. And then outside counsel says, we feel good about that. Right. So it isn't ever a one size fits all. They've got people who like they just love the problem of boxes and
Mhm.
and they'll collaborate with you to make a solution that fits. And if you're super specialized, you may not be able to avoid sending your subject matter experts there side by side, not for the invoices and the POs, but for like the PNIDs and as builts and stuff that like it would be too difficult, right? So depending upon your industry and what you're trying to accomplish, to Kim's point, will determine what that mix of
Yep.
you and the storage vendor looks like.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, we have a lot of kind of, roundtables, user groups, events where peers, organizations, various teams kind of exchange their own referrals and experiences.
Yep.
And so I would definitely encourage everybody to reach out to their own networks and communities and ask, well, what technology tools are you using? Are you happy with them? Pun intended, don't box yourself in. If
Oh
something
boy, that was
doesn't fit for
terrible.
you, it may have fit for you at some point in time, but if it's not growing with you, it's always okay to break up. It's
Yep.
always okay. So with that said, I
I think we're
wanted
done.
to,
Is there one slide? And
yeah,
this is just right. What did we talk about, right? And like as you hopefully as you can see, if you go out of order, sometimes you can go into one of these steps. The important thing is to go back and make sure you drag everybody to the first step. So like, hey, we built a steering committee. Who's accountable? Okay, let's figure it out. Hey, we're gonna buy this tech. Okay, well, right. So the important thing is that when you hopefully you see when you have all these in place, when let's just call it general counsel, she knows that she's going to make sure that the organization does this because she's the one that gets on the plane and gets in trouble. You get all the folks around the table to say, yeah, we're going to support her, and we're going to make sure that we make all the right decisions, right? So that we're all bought in and our organizations are now bought in. And we've designed this process that if we follow it, we get consistent results that general counsel is comfortable with, the brain trust is comfortable, outside counsel is comfortable, your smiling consultant is comfortable. And then the culture is easier because no one feels like they're on the hook. We're just doing our job. And then we know what tech we need. Then it's easy to make the decision about tech, and you have a much higher chance of IT being successful with it. So we're not buying some technology and throwing it into the wall to figure out what to use it for. We know exactly what we want it to do. So you
Yeah.
can see how these 5 steps, and this is not complicated. It fits on a note card, but as we've talked about, the culture, the doing it. And the other problem is data cleanup is going to be 3 to 5 years. You're a Fortune 1000 company, you have dozens, if not hundreds of petabytes. Most solutions out there, if you could scan a petabyte a week, you'd be doing amazing. So it's years. So this is not like, let's just get it done and we'll move on. This is like kind of like years and years of working together to do this. And so that introduces the psychology is important because people aren't going to be able to be done. It's
Yep.
like we're kind of signing up for this to be like finance. We don't stop doing finance. It's a permanent function. Information governance really is a persistent function. And so having it be straightforward is important because we're going to have to do this for years and years and years and years
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
years and
And just
years.
quickly to wrap up, people always wonder what next after this? What
Yep.
comes after the cleanup? Ideally, everybody loves you, it succeeded, you've accomplished something that has, failed multiple times before. But, I think having a shared vision of what the end outcome will be really important to your point of, shared vision.
Yep.
What are we trying to accomplish?
Yeah, and I think what's above the waterline is what you can see, right? Cost reduction, if that's something that you were cared about. Certainly data security, smaller footprint. For sure, efficiency, people will notice that right away. Also just de-risk in general. But underneath the surface is the stuff that has to come after the cleanup that you don't often see, which is, right, we're monitoring to make sure this is happening. We can't,
Yep.
the process doesn't run itself. It doesn't require judgment, but we've got to keep it checked. And then policy updates, right? The policy is not going to be perfect out of the gate. The retention schedule is not going to be a perennial. It's like we've got to keep these updated based on the results of the process being executed over and over again, changes in the regulatory landscape, changes in our business. We buy a business, we divest a business. So again, it's not a set it and forget it. It'd be awesome if it was. But this is not losing weight for your high school reunion. This is getting healthy forever. So that you're not just going to get all looking good and go to your high school reunion and make everyone jealous and then get unhealthy again.
Yeah.
This is like being furthering health in your life. This is like we need healthy information governance continuously as part of the culture. And so,
Yeah.
sorry.
I love that. I love that as your like parting words. And thank you everybody for, actively participating in the Q&A. Data cleanup is not just one and done conversation. You can find Joe on LinkedIn, and he's constantly traveling across the country for his job. But we will also be at a slew of events and conferences coming
Y'all
up
are
as early
busy.
as next week. We will be very busy, including being at ARMA Houston in just a couple of weeks. And Joe is one of the very
Conference organizers.
involved, very involved organizers and event committee at ARMA Houston. You're also involved in a couple of other local chapters across the
Yeah, I'm on the
country.
board of Los Angeles, Greater Los Angeles. I get involved a lot with St. Louis. I get involved a lot with New York. I spoke at their spring show a little while back. Omaha, Nebraska, awesome chapter. I was at Utah last week, another great chapter. Honestly, like the smaller chapters sometimes are some of the strongest because
Yeah.
maybe there's only 30 people when you go there, but like you meet all of them and they're really engaged. Sometimes you go to the bigger shows and I feel like I don't meet as many people. Speaking of big shows, I'll be at IAPP next week. So you'll see me in the lobby of the hotel, hanging out,
Yeah.
chatting, talking shop. Would
Fun.
love to see folks there if you're there. It's a great show.
Yes, so again, we will be sending out the recording. We had a couple questions around that.
Mhm.
So everybody who registered, feel free to share the recording, review the recording, share it with folks, share it with your general counsel, cough,
Yeah.
cough. And we will be at AIM, InfoNext, a slew of ARMAs, including ARMA Canada. And for those who are Laserfiche users. We will see you in Las Vegas at the end of April. And so again, thank you again, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Joe, so much. It's
Thank
always
you.
such a great time chatting with you
Oh,
live.
love
Um,
working with you all.
and we will see everybody around the block.
Cheers,
Bye.
everybody. Have a good day.